Welcome to First Sleep Aid, calm stories to help you unwind, learn, and fall asleep. From true crime to curious facts and thoughtful ideas, always softly spoken. Subscribe now and take a deep breath. You're in good hands. Okay, so you know how there are just some stories that just kind of get stuck in your head, and they just don't seem to want to fade away?
Yeah, totally.
The disappearance of Madeleine McCann, I think, is like a prime example of that.
It is. It's
It happened all the way back in 2007,
mhm.
and it feels like we're still talking about it as much as we were back then.
Yeah, we are. And I think it's a case that continues to resonate with people, you know. It's a young child, only 3 years old,
Right.
vanishing from a holiday apartment in Portugal
Just gone.
on May 3rd, 2007.
Mm.
And her parents were just a short distance away having dinner with friends,
Hmm.
and her younger siblings, twins, were asleep in the same room.
It's like an absolute nightmare scenario for any parent.
It is.
It's just terrifying.
Yeah, and I think that's part of why it stayed with us for so long, plus the fact that there just haven't been any real answers.
Yeah, and that's what we're here to do today.
Exact.
To sift through all the noise because there's been so much speculation, so many theories over the years.
So much.
We're really just going to look at the core elements of the case
Yeah.
based on investigative timelines and some really insightful essays that we've got.
Yeah, and we're fortunate to have access to some really great resources.
Yeah,
And they do offer these different perspectives,
right.
which I think is always helpful.
Yeah.
So we're going to try to make sense of this incredibly sad and perplexing situation.
And we're going to trace the timeline all the way from that night in Praia da Luz through the involvement of not just the Portuguese authorities, but the UK and German authorities as well.
And we're talking about a timeline that spans almost 2 decades now.
It's crazy.
It really highlights the complexity of this case and how it just continues to unfold.
Right. So let's just rewind all the way back
Back to the beginning.
to May 3rd, 2007.
Okay.
Kate McCann goes to check on the children around 10 p.m. local time.
Yeah.
And just what a horrifying discovery to make.
Devastating. I mean, the timeline lays it out pretty clearly. Kate finds Madeleine missing from her bed. Thankfully, the twins are still asleep. But the window to the bedroom is open,
Oh, wow.
and the shutter's raised. Immediately, that suggests an entry point, right, or an exit point.
Yeah.
So just, immediately raises questions.
Yeah, and how quickly things escalated.
Oh, my God.
From just a normal family holiday to like a full-blown international incident.
It's unbelievable. And one thing that really struck me from reading these initial reports was the disorganization of the initial response.
From the Portuguese authorities.
Yeah, from the Portuguese authorities.
Right.
A lot of the early criticisms focused on that.
What were some of the key issues, you think, in those crucial first few hours?
Well, the timeline really highlights this failure to secure a perimeter around the apartment quickly enough.
And that's crucial in a case like this, right?
Absolutely, especially when every minute could be vital.
Yeah.
But because of this lack of security, you had holidaymakers, staff from the resort, even the McCann's friends, all wandering in and out of what should have been a crime scene.
So potentially contaminating evidence.
Exactly. And that's not even mentioning the delays in getting forensics involved to secure things like fingerprints and footprints. And then, perhaps even more crucial in those initial hours, there were delays in alerting border control and airports.
Which could have been the difference, right?
Absolutely. Especially if whoever took Madeleine was trying to get her out of the country quickly.
Yeah.
Those early hours, they're so vital. And the lack of a streamlined protocol, it really raises questions about missed opportunities.
Yeah. I mean, it paints a picture of chaos, doesn't it?
It really does.
And it makes you wonder how much that affected the rest of the investigation.
It had to have had some impact, for sure.
Yeah.
But, in contrast to the sort of disorganization, there was this massive public response.
Oh.
People all over the world were following the story.
It was everywhere.
It was huge. There were volunteer search efforts. Interpol and UK authorities were quickly notified. And, of course, the media just exploded.
I remember that. It was just constant coverage.
It was. And initially, the Portuguese authorities, they treated it as a missing person case.
Which I guess you would for a child that young, right?
You would think so. But the scale of it all and the circumstances quickly suggested that it might be something much more sinister.
Right. And amidst all this chaos, the McCann family make a very deliberate decision to put themselves in the public eye.
Yeah, they really did.
I mean, they launched that website, findmadeleine.com. They were constantly holding press conferences.
You really were.
doing everything they could to keep Madeleine's story in the headlines.
Yeah, and they even garnered support from some really high-profile figures,
Yeah.
like celebrities and politicians, who use their platforms to amplify the search efforts.
What do you think were their motivations behind this very public approach?
Well, based on what our sources suggest, it was primarily driven by sheer desperation to find their daughter.
Of course.
They really believed that by keeping Madeleine's face and name out there, they could keep the pressure on the authorities.
Yeah, make sure that no one forgets about Madeleine.
Exactly. And also generate new leads, of course. But as you can imagine, this approach wasn't without its critics.
Yeah, there was a lot of backlash too, wasn't there?
Yeah, some people questioned their constant media appearances, the fundraising efforts, even their demeanor in interviews.
Yeah, it was tough to watch sometimes.
It was, and it really highlights that intense scrutiny that parents in these kinds of tragedies face.
It's that double-edged sword, isn't it?
It is.
You're doing everything you can to find your child, but you're also opening yourself up to judgment and speculation.
Exactly. And it just adds another layer of heartbreak to an already unimaginable situation.
And I think that leads us to a really crucial point in the timeline. In September 2007, just a few months after Madeleine's disappearance, the focus of the investigation takes a very dramatic turn.
Yeah, things took a dark turn. The Portuguese police named Kate and Jerry McCann as official suspects.
Wow, or Gritos, as they called them, right?
That's right. And you can only imagine the psychological impact that must have had on them.
It's unimaginable.
Being considered potentially responsible for your own child's disappearance. Devastating.
What was the basis for this shift in suspicion?
Well, a couple of things seem to contribute to it. First, there were these alleged inconsistencies that the police identified in the McCann statements.
So discrepancies in their accounts of what happened that night.
Yeah, and that definitely raised some eyebrows. But the bigger issue, at least in terms of public perception, was the findings of these British cadaver dogs that were brought in to assist the investigation.
I remember hearing about that. That seemed like a big deal at the time.
It was huge.
Yeah.
These dogs reportedly detected traces of blood and what they called a death scent in the family's holiday apartment, and also later in a rental car they had used.
So it sounded like there was physical evidence suggesting Madeleine might have died in the apartment.
That was certainly the implication, and it really fueled public suspicion towards the McCanns.
And at the time, were there any counter-arguments or questions raised about the reliability of that evidence?
Well, there were some concerns raised, and rightly so. While the dog's findings were presented as pretty damning evidence, the forensic analysis, especially the DNA testing, wasn't actually conclusive.
Meaning?
They couldn't definitively say that the traces found were Madeleine's.
So it was all circumstantial.
It was, and there's been ongoing debate within the forensic science community about the reliability of cadaver dogs in these kinds of cases.
So it might not have been as clear-cut as it initially seemed.
Exactly. And eventually, in July 2008, the Portuguese public prosecutor actually closed the case, citing a lack of evidence.
So the McCanns were cleared.
Yes, their arguido status was lifted, as was the status of Robert Murat, who was another person briefly considered a suspect.
So they were officially no longer considered suspects.
That's right, but you can imagine the damage had already been done, both to their reputations and to their relationship with the Portuguese authorities.
I can't even imagine what they went through during that time.
It must have been absolutely horrific.
But even though the case was closed in Portugal, the search for Madeleine didn't stop there, right? In 2011, we saw the launch of Operation Grange in the UK. So what prompted this renewed effort?
Well, it was initiated at the request of the UK Home Office, and it essentially represented a complete review of all the existing evidence gathered by both the Portuguese and British authorities.
So fresh set of eyes,
Yeah.
a new perspective.
Exactly. And the scope of Operation Grange was immense.
Meaning?
Over the next several years, they re-examined thousands of documents, witness statements, forensic reports, everything.
And did they manage to uncover any new leads or significant findings through this process?
They did find some inconsistencies in the original timelines that had been provided by various witnesses.
Oh, so that's interesting.
Yeah, and they also explored nearly 200 potential new investigative opportunities.
Wow.
They even created new e-fit images based on these reevaluations, hoping that they might jog someone's memory.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and in 2014, they also conducted ground searches in and around Praia da Luz.
I remember that.
It was all over the news, but unfortunately, they didn't find any human remains or any significant physical evidence related to Madeleine.
So no breakthrough.
Not really. And by 2015, the scale of Operation Grange was scaled back quite a bit. But officially, the investigation remained ongoing, although they didn't have any active primary suspects at that point.
Right, so it was still open, but not as active.
Exactly. It really shows how difficult it is to solve a cold case years after the event, especially one that had such a messy initial investigation.
Yeah, those early missteps can really come back to haunt you.
Absolutely. But then in 2020, there was a major development. The German authorities named Christian Bruckner as their prime suspect.
Right, this was huge news.
After years of seemingly no progress, this felt like a significant breakthrough.
So what led them to Bruckner?
Well, he was a German national who had lived in the Praia de Luz area for quite a while, between 1995 and 2007.
So he was familiar with the area.
He was. But even more significantly, he had a serious criminal record, including multiple convictions for sexual abuse and child exploitation.
Oh, wow, so very disturbing history.
Yes, and it was this background, combined with some new information they had gathered, that led them to believe he might be involved in Madeleine's disappearance.
And what specifically linked him to the case?
Several things. First, mobile phone data placed him in the vicinity of the Ocean Club on the very night Madeleine disappeared.
So he was definitely in the area.
He was, and there were reports of him having conversations with associates where he talked about abducting a child.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, very disturbing stuff. And then there were claims from various informants, even people he had been in prison with, who alleged that he had made incriminating statements about the McCann case.
So multiple people claiming he had basically confessed.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
And then there was also the fact that he owned a VW camper van and a Jaguar, both of which the police examined.
Right, I remember seeing pictures of those vehicles in the news.
Yeah, they became a big part of the story, although no definitive forensic link to Madeleine was ever publicly confirmed.
So a lot of circumstantial evidence, but nothing concrete tying him to Madeleine.
Exactly.
And what about legal proceedings? Has Bruckner faced any charges related to Madeleine's disappearance?
Not directly, no. Yeah. Although German prosecutors have stated publicly that they believe Madeleine is dead and that they have concrete evidence that Bruckner is responsible, they haven't yet revealed the specifics of that evidence.
So they're confident, but they're holding their cards close to their chest.
That's right. But he was charged in Germany with several unrelated sexual offenses.
Right, so those charges weren't directly connected to Madeleine?
No, but they stem from a separate investigation. And in 2023, he went to trial for those charges. He was actually acquitted on some of them due to what the court said was insufficient evidence.
Wow.
But here's the key thing. He's still incarcerated in Germany. He was already serving a long prison sentence for a 2005 rape of an elderly woman in Portugal.
Oh, wow, so he's behind bars, but not specifically for anything related to Madeleine.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean the investigation into his potential involvement is over.
Right, so are the German and Portuguese authorities still actively working on this case?
They are. Both have confirmed that their investigations into Bruckner in relation to the McCann case are ongoing.
That's good to hear.
It is. And German prosecutors have said they're trying to build a stronger case against him, presumably by gathering more definitive evidence.
Yeah, they need more than just circumstantial evidence if they're going to charge him, right?
Exactly. And there was actually a renewed search operation in May 2023 near the Arade Dam in Portugal.
Oh, wow. I hadn't heard about that.
Yeah, it wasn't as widely publicized as some of the previous searches. It was conducted at the request of the German investigators because Bruckner was known to have frequented that area.
Okay, so they're still actively looking for evidence.
They are, but unfortunately no significant new evidence was reported from that search.
So after all this time, all the investigations, the focus on Bruckner, Madeleine McCann is still missing.
She is, and he hasn't been formally charged in connection with her disappearance.
It's just incredibly frustrating for everyone involved.
It is, and the timeline just keeps ticking, doesn't it? The legal complexities increase.
How so?
Well, take the German authorities, for example. They're facing a potential time limit related to Bruckner's current prison sentence.
What do you mean?
His current sentence is set to end in September 2025.
So they're up against a deadline.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
If they want to keep him detained in connection with the McCann case, they'd probably need to file charges before his current sentence runs out.
Oh, wow.
It's a tricky situation. And meanwhile, you have Madeleine's parents, who are still actively campaigning, still holding on to hope after all these years.
Yeah, their dedication is just incredible.
It is, and it really highlights the enduring impact of this tragedy.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what do you think are the most important takeaways? The things that really demonstrate just how massive, how long-lasting, and how complicated this case has been?
I think the first takeaway has to be the sheer length of this case.
Spanning almost 2 decades.
Almost 2 decades.
Yeah.
And still, we're no closer to knowing for sure what happened to Madeleine.
It's mind-boggling.
It is. And we've seen so many phases of this investigation. It started as a missing persons inquiry, then shifted to suspicion on the parents, and now it's focused on a convicted sex offender in another country.
And each phase has had its own unique challenges.
Exactly. And then the second takeaway, I think, has to be the emotional journey of the McCann family. They chose to be very public with their grief and their search, and that drew a lot of attention, both positive and negative.
It was impossible to ignore them.
It was, and they faced immense pressure and scrutiny, but they never gave up on finding Madeleine.
And then lastly,
I think this case really highlights the difficulties of international law enforcement cooperation.
especially in a case this high profile.
Exactly. You've got multiple agencies involved, each with their own procedures and legal frameworks. It's a lot to navigate, and it undoubtedly complicated the investigation.
So it's 2025. We're almost 20 years on from Madeleine's disappearance.
It's crazy to think about it.
And there are still so many unanswered questions.
So many. Like, what does it mean that after all this time, there's still no definitive evidence?
Yeah, what does that tell us?
And how has all the media attention, both good and bad, affected the search for the truth?
It must have had some impact, right?
It had to have. And what about the challenges of international cooperation? Did that hinder the investigation in any way?
I mean, these are all questions that could be debated endlessly.
They could.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think the disappearance of Madeleine McCann is a story about a lot more than just a missing child.
Right, it's about so much more.
It's about our need for answers, our desire for justice, and the ways in which grief can play out on a global stage.
It's a story that just keeps resonating.
It does. And it's a story that, unfortunately, doesn't seem to have an ending in sight.
Well, I think that's a pretty good note to end on.
Yeah.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with me.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
And for everyone listening, thanks for joining us. And until next time, keep those critical thinking caps on.